A true story of St. Patrick, the young man torn from his home. Imagine being torn away from your family while you were still young. Imagine waking up one day in a strange land, surrounded by people you do not know, speaking a language you do not understand, with no idea whether you will ever see your loved ones again. Now imagine spending years living as a slave, far from everything you have ever known. For many people, an experience like that would completely destroy all hope. But for a young man named Patrick, what seemed to be the end of his life would become the beginning of a story that would endure for centuries. A story marked by suffering, faith, escape, courage, and a mission that would forever change the religious history of Ireland. But there is one detail that makes this story even more remarkable. Patrick was not born in Ireland, and according to his own account, he did not even grow up deeply committed to the Christian faith. He was a young Briton born into a Christian family, but, as he would later confess, he did not spend his youth with a particularly fervent faith. His father was a man of social standing and, according to Patrick himself, held important responsibilities within the society of his time. His father was also a deacon, while his grandfather was a priest. Even so, Patrick would later admit that during his youth he did not give his faith the importance it deserved. He knew Christianity. He grew up surrounded by people who professed the faith. But knowing a religion does not necessarily mean living according to it. And that difference would become essential to understanding the transformation that took place in his life. Because before he became known as St. Patrick, before he was remembered as the Evangelizer of Ireland, before the stories of shamrocks, snakes, and miracles, there was simply a young man living a relatively ordinary life, until everything changed. And perhaps the most important part of Patrick's story is this. His life did not begin with a great mission. It began with a tragedy. Sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century, while Patrick was still a young man, his homeland was attacked by raiders from Ireland. At that time, the borders of the Roman world were becoming increasingly vulnerable. The Western Roman Empire was undergoing profound changes. Roman authority was weakening across many regions. Different groups moved throughout the British territories. Raids and invasions became more frequent. It was in this context that Patrick's life was shattered. According to his own testimony, he was captured. It was not a decision. It was not a journey. It was not a choice. He was taken by force, torn away from his home, separated from his family, and carried across the sea to Ireland. Try to imagine what that meant for a young man of that time. No telephone, no way to send a message, no idea whether his parents were still alive, no certainty that he would ever return, no way of knowing how long he would remain there. To him, Ireland was a foreign land, a place he did not know, a land where he had no freedom. And there began one of the most difficult seasons of his life. Patrick became a slave. He wrote about this period himself in his work known as the Confessio, one of the most important historical sources about his life. It is because of this document that we are able to know Patrick's story through his own words. We do not have a complete autobiography written by him. We do not know every detail of his childhood. We cannot reconstruct every event of his life with precision. But we do have his testimony, and that testimony is extraordinary, because in it, Patrick speaks about suffering, he speaks about guilt, he speaks about faith, he speaks about prayer, and he speaks about the inner transformation that took place during the years he lived as a slave. In Ireland, he was forced to work as a shepherd, and that detail is incredibly significant. Imagine going from the relative safety of family life to the loneliness of the countryside. Imagine tending livestock for endless hours. Imagine spending day after day exposed to cold, rain, and hardship. Imagine being completely alone, without freedom, without family, without friends, without knowing what tomorrow would bring. It was in that setting that Patrick began to look inward, and it was there that his faith began to change. He himself admitted that before he was captured, he had not lived a deeply spiritual life. But slavery led him into an entirely different experience. In solitude, he began to pray, constantly. Prayer was no longer merely a family tradition. It was no longer simply something he had learned as a child. Prayer became a necessity, a way to survive, a way to find meaning, a way to remain standing when everything around him had fallen apart. And this is where the story begins to take on a profound spiritual dimension. Because according to Patrick, it was during those years of slavery that he began seeking God with an intensity he had never known before. He prayed continually, and the more he prayed, the more his understanding of his own life began to change. The young man who had once paid little attention to his faith began to see his existence in a completely different light. He no longer viewed his situation only as a tragedy. He began to see it as a season of transformation. That does not mean his suffering stopped being suffering. Slavery remained a brutal reality. The loss of freedom was still a deep wound. The separation from his family still caused pain. But within that hardship, something new began to grow. A deeper faith, a stronger trust, a hope that no longer depended on circumstances. And perhaps that is exactly what makes Patrick's testimony so powerful. He does not tell the story of a life without suffering. He tells the story of a faith that was born in the midst of suffering. For approximately 6 years, Patrick lived as a slave in Ireland. 6 years. For a young man, that is an enormous portion of life. If he was about 16 years old when he was captured, as is traditionally understood from his own account, then he spent much of his youth in slavery. 6 years away from home, 6 years without freedom, 6 years not knowing whether he would ever be free again. Then something happened that would change everything. According to his own testimony, Patrick had a spiritual experience that led him to believe he should escape. He received what he described as a calling, an inner prompting, a message encouraging him to leave, and he believed it. The problem was obvious. How could a slave simply run away? He had no guarantees, no certainty of success, no idea what awaited him, but something deep inside told him he had to try. And so began one of the most remarkable chapters of his story, his escape. Patrick managed to flee. We do not know every detail of how it happened, and it is important to acknowledge that. Many of the popular stories told about St. Patrick over the centuries include details that do not appear in his own writings. For that reason, if we want to understand the true story of Patrick, we must distinguish between what he personally recorded and what later traditions and legends added. What we do know is that he succeeded in leaving Ireland. After years of living as a slave, he was finally free. But freedom did not mean everything was solved. He still had to make the long journey home, and that meant facing a dangerous voyage, a journey that, in those days, could take weeks or even months, without the conveniences of the modern world, without accurate maps, without reliable transportation. Patrick had to trust that he would somehow reach his destination, and he did. After years away, he finally returned to his homeland. Imagine that moment. After believing he might never see his family again, he was finally home, free, alive, back in his own land. For almost anyone else, that might have been the perfect moment to forget everything, to rebuild a new life, to seek safety, to live in peace, to leave the years of suffering behind. But Patrick had changed. The young man who had been captured was no longer the same person. The experience of slavery had transformed the way he saw the world, and according to his own testimony, something even more surprising was about to happen. He believed he had received a calling to return to Ireland. Yes, to return to the very place where he had been enslaved, to the same land where he had suffered, to the same people connected to the greatest personal tragedy of his life. It is difficult to imagine a more unexpected decision. He could have chosen never to go back. He could have held on to bitterness. He could have decided that Ireland deserved nothing from him. But according to his own account, he came to believe that he was called to return. And from that moment on, Patrick's story became more than the story of a young man who had been enslaved. It became the story of a missionary, a man who believed he had received a mission to bring the gospel to the people of Ireland. And here we need to pause, because this is the point where many popular versions of Patrick's story begin blending historical facts with legend. Over the centuries, Patrick became surrounded by extraordinary stories. Stories of miracles, of snakes, of the famous shamrock used to explain the Holy Trinity, of dramatic confrontations with pagan leaders. Some of these stories are deeply symbolic and form part of the tradition that grew around his memory, but they do not appear in the same way in Patrick's own writings. So if we want to discover the true story, we must return to the earliest sources. And when we do, we find something perhaps even more extraordinary than the legends. We find a man who suffered, a man who was enslaved, a man who spent years separated from his family, a man who, after gaining his freedom, chose to return to the very place where he had once been taken against his will, all because of a mission he believed God had entrusted to him. That is the true greatness of St. Patrick's story. It is not merely the story of a man said to have performed miracles. It is the story of someone who passed through suffering and found purpose, the story of someone who could have chosen resentment but instead chose mission, the story of someone who, after experiencing slavery, devoted his life to the very people among whom he had once lived as a captive. And that leads us to an important question. Why did he go back? What happened in the heart of that man that led him to make such a difficult decision? And above all, what was Patrick's return to Ireland really like? How was he received? Who were the people he encountered? What dangers did he face? And did he truly convert all of Ireland, as some traditions claim? The answers to those questions are found in one of the most fascinating parts of his story, because Patrick did not return to Ireland as a conqueror. He returned as a missionary, and when he set foot once again on that land, he began a mission that would forever shape the way his name would be remembered. But before returning, Patrick had to confront something that may have been even harder than slavery itself: fear. The fear of going back, the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of facing once again the people connected to his painful past. But according to his testimony, he believed that God was calling him, and once he became convinced of that calling, he chose to obey. The young man who had first arrived in Ireland as a slave would return years later under entirely different circumstances. Now he would return by choice. Now he would return with a mission. Now he would return carrying a message. And from that moment forward, the most well-known chapter of his life would begin: the evangelization of Ireland, a mission that would not be easy, a mission filled with challenges, opposition, and danger, a mission that would give rise to countless stories passed down through generations, but also a mission that would make Patrick one of the most influential Christian figures in Irish history. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of his story. The young man who was taken to Ireland against his will would one day choose to return. The slave would become a missionary. The young man who admitted he had once neglected his faith would become a man completely devoted to God's calling. And the one who had once stood alone in the fields, wondering if he would ever see home again, would one day be remembered by millions across the centuries. But how did that transformation happen? What was the journey back like? And what did Patrick find when he finally returned to Ireland? That is what we will discover in the next part of this story, because the true story of St. Patrick is only beginning, and the more we learn about his life, the more we realize that behind the legends stood a real man, a man who suffered, a man who was afraid, a man who stumbled, a man who believed, and a man who chose to follow what he understood to be God's calling. Until the next chapter, the escape and the call that brought him back. For 6 long years, Patrick lived as a slave in a land he had never known. The young man who had once left home surrounded by his family now lived far from everything familiar. There was no freedom, there was no comfort, there was no certainty about tomorrow. Every day began the same way. He had to work, tend the animals, and simply survive. Yet it was in that place of loneliness that something began to change within him. Patrick began to seek God. Prayer, which had once held only a small place in his life, became his constant companion. As he watched over the flocks, far from the towns and the people he had once known, his thoughts turned toward heaven. Alone for hours in those fields, Patrick found a place where he could speak with God. According to his own testimony, it was there that his faith began to grow. His suffering did not disappear. Slavery remained a painful reality. The longing for his family never left him. But in the midst of those circumstances, Patrick began to see his life differently. He came to believe that he had not been abandoned, and that conviction gave him the strength to endure. Then, after years in captivity, something happened that would once again change the course of his life. Patrick believed he had received divine guidance to escape. In his own writings, he describes a spiritual experience that convinced him it was time to leave that place behind. The decision was incredibly dangerous. To flee meant abandoning everything he had come to know in that foreign land and attempting the long journey home. If he were captured, the consequences could be devastating. But Patrick chose to trust, and so he left. We do not know every detail of his escape. The ancient sources do not describe every step of his journey. What we do know is that after some time, he succeeded in escaping slavery and eventually returned to his homeland. After approximately 6 years away from home, young Patrick was finally free. Imagine the moment when his feet touched his homeland once again. After so many years, he had finally returned to the place where he believed he belonged. The freedom he had dreamed about through countless difficult days had become reality. His home stood before him once again. His family was near. The life he thought he had lost seemed to have been restored. But Patrick was no longer the same young man who had been taken away. The years of suffering had left deep scars. His view of life had changed, his faith had matured, and there was something within him that would not allow him to simply forget everything he had lived through. He could have chosen to remain in safety. He could have rebuilt his life. He could have decided never to set foot in Ireland again. After all, it was the place where he had been enslaved. It was the land that represented the greatest pain of his life. Yet, according to the testimony he left behind, Patrick began to believe that God had another purpose for him. Then something happened that seems almost impossible to imagine. He believed he was being called to return to Ireland, to return to the people who had taken part in his captivity, to return to the land where he had suffered, not as a slave, not as a prisoner, but as a missionary. The decision seemed completely contradictory. Why return to the very place he had fought so hard to escape? Why leave behind the safety he had finally found? Why willingly face that unfamiliar land once more? Patrick believed he had found the answer. He came to understand that his experience had not been merely a series of tragedies. He believed that God had allowed him to walk that painful path in order to prepare him for a greater mission. His suffering would not be the end of his story. It would become part of it. The man who had arrived in Ireland against his will would now choose to return of his own free will. That decision reveals the profound transformation that had taken place within his heart. The slave who had once dreamed only of escape now longed to return. The young man who had arrived alone would now come back carrying a message. The one who had lost his freedom now desired to use that very freedom to serve others. But returning to Ireland would not be easy. At that time, the island was home to a society made up of many different tribes and communities. There were local rulers, there were ancient religious traditions, there were established structures of power. Christianity was already known in some regions, but it had not yet become firmly established throughout Irish society. Patrick knew that his mission would face resistance. Even so, he believed he had to fulfill what he understood to be God's calling. And so, a new journey began. This time, Patrick was not running away. He was walking toward his destiny. The man who had once been taken to Ireland as a captive would now return as a free man, and over time his presence would begin to leave a lasting mark upon that land. Patrick began to proclaim his faith. He spoke about Christ, he taught, he preached, he baptized those who accepted his message, and he worked to establish Christian communities. But he did not enter an empty land. Christianity already had a presence in Ireland before his ministry began. This is an important historical detail if we want to understand his story accurately. Patrick was not the first Christian to set foot on the island. Before him, other missionaries had already worked among the Irish people. One of the best-known figures was Palladius, who had been sent to minister to existing Christian communities in Ireland. For that reason, Patrick's historical importance does not lie in being the very first Christian missionary to reach Ireland. His role was different. He became one of the central figures in the expansion and strengthening of Christianity across the island. His mission unfolded within a society deeply rooted in its own traditions and beliefs. To proclaim the gospel, Patrick had to travel across different territories. He had to meet local leaders. He had to speak with people who did not share his faith. He had to overcome suspicion, and he had to face those who were unwilling to see their ancient religious traditions replaced. We do not know every place he visited. The historical sources are limited, nor can we reconstruct every event of his mission with complete certainty. But Patrick's own writings reveal that he understood the dangers he faced. He knew his mission could place his life at risk, yet he continued. In his writings, Patrick never portrays himself as a powerful man. Quite the opposite. He openly acknowledges his limitations. He admits his weaknesses. He reflects on his former life, and throughout his testimony, he expresses a profound dependence on God. This is one of the qualities that sets his account apart from the heroic legends that developed in later centuries. Patrick does not write as a man seeking glory. He writes as someone convinced that he has been called. To him, his mission was never a personal achievement. It was a sacred responsibility, and it was with that conviction that he continued moving forward. As his message spread, his presence began to attract attention. Ireland's local rulers held great influence over their communities. Because of that, introducing a new faith could easily create conflict with established powers and long-held traditions. Patrick had to confront not only religious differences, but also the complex social structure of Irish society. He needed to earn people's trust. He needed to build meaningful relationships. He needed to find those who were willing to listen. And at times, he had to endure open opposition. This part of his story is essential. For centuries, many popular accounts transformed Patrick into an almost legendary figure, surrounded by extraordinary events and miraculous tales. Yet the true story is, in many ways, even more remarkable. What stands before us is a real man, a man who was captured, a man who experienced slavery, a man who escaped, a man who returned home, and a man who voluntarily chose to return to the very place where he had once suffered. That decision lies at the heart of his story, because it reveals that Patrick refused to let his past define his future. He could not erase what had happened. He could not recover the years he had lost. He could not change the fact that he had been torn away from his family. But he could choose what to do with the life that still lay before him. And he chose a mission. It was that mission that, over time, gave rise to countless stories about his work in Ireland. Some were preserved in historical documents. Others were passed down from generation to generation. And many gained new details as the centuries went by. One of the most famous is the story of the shamrock. According to a later tradition, Patrick used a 3-leaf clover to explain the mystery of the Holy Trinity. 3 leaves, one single plant, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That image became one of the most enduring symbols associated with St. Patrick. However, an important distinction must be made. There is no contemporary historical evidence confirming that Patrick actually used the shamrock in this way. The story belongs primarily to traditions that developed long after his lifetime. The same is true of another one of the most famous stories associated with his name. According to legend, Patrick drove every snake out of Ireland. For centuries, this account has been repeated as one of the greatest miracles attributed to him. Historically, however, there is no evidence that such an event ever occurred. In fact, Ireland is not believed to have had a native population of snakes after the end of the last ice age. Because of this, many historians interpret the story symbolically. The snakes may represent paganism, evil, or the spiritual forces that later tradition associated with Patrick's mission. These stories are important because they help us understand how his memory was shaped over the centuries. But we should not confuse tradition with what history can confidently affirm. And even when the legends are set aside, we are still left with an extraordinary story. the story of a young man who lost everything, a slave who found freedom, a man who returned home, and someone who, after regaining his own freedom, chose to return in order to serve others. That transformation explains much of the enduring power of his legacy. Patrick believed that God had guided every step of his life. That conviction appears consistently throughout his writings. He never considered himself superior to others. He never believed his mission depended solely on his own abilities. His confidence rested entirely in God. According to his own testimony, it was that faith that sustained him through his darkest moments. Yet his mission was far from easy. As he continued his work, Patrick encountered opposition. Some rejected his message, some leaders viewed his presence as a threat, others simply refused to abandon the traditions they had followed for generations. Patrick understood the risks. Even so, he pressed on. His story, therefore, is not merely a story about evangelization. It is also a story of courage. The courage to return, the courage to face the unknown, the courage to proclaim his faith in a place where acceptance was never guaranteed, and above all, the courage to keep going even when he had no certainty about the outcome. But one important question still remains. If Patrick was not the first Christian to reach Ireland, if Christianity already existed in parts of the island, and if other missionaries had worked there before him, why did his name become so important? Why, centuries later, would millions of people still remember him? The answer lies in the strength of his legacy. Patrick became one of the central figures in Ireland's Christian memory. His mission became closely associated with the growth of the Christian faith. His story was passed from one generation to the next, and as the centuries unfolded, his historical life became surrounded by symbols, traditions, and legends. The real man and the legendary figure gradually became intertwined. Yet beneath all those stories, one truth remains. Patrick knew pain, he knew loneliness, he knew slavery, but he also knew freedom. And after experiencing all of those things, he chose to dedicate his life to a mission. Perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons his story teaches. We cannot always choose what happens to us. Patrick did not choose to be captured. He did not choose to become a slave. He did not choose to spend years separated from his family. But once he regained his freedom, he chose what he would do with it. And that decision changed the course of his life. He could have spent the rest of his days trying to forget. Instead, he chose to live for a purpose. He could have built a peaceful life far away from Ireland. Instead, he chose to return. He could have carried nothing but memories of pain. Instead, he transformed those memories into a story of faith. And that is how the journey began for the man who would one day become known throughout the world as Saint Patrick. But Patrick's greatest challenges were still ahead. As he became more deeply involved in Irish society, he would encounter powerful leaders and situations that would put his mission at risk. There would be confrontations, there would be threats, there would be moments when his own life would hang in the balance, and it would be during these events that some of the most famous traditions associated with his name would begin to emerge. But what actually happened? Which events can be regarded as historical? Which stories were added only centuries later? And how did a former slave become one of the most influential figures in the history of Irish Christianity? The answers begin when Patrick found himself standing before the powers of his time. It was at that moment that his mission became more than a simple journey of faith. It became a true battle for the message he believed God had entrusted to him. The story continues in the next chapter. As Patrick's mission expanded, he would face powerful rulers, growing opposition, and challenges that would test every conviction he held. His courage would be questioned, his faith would be tested, and the legacy he would leave behind would begin to take shape. The years ahead would transform him from a missionary into one of the most influential figures in Ireland's Christian history. Yet throughout it all, one important truth remained. Patrick never claimed to be extraordinary. He never presented himself as a flawless hero. Instead, he saw himself as an ordinary man whom God had chosen to accomplish an extraordinary mission. Perhaps that is why his story has endured for so many centuries, not because it is a tale without suffering, not because it is filled with spectacular miracles, but because it tells the story of someone who refused to let pain have the final word. A young man who had once been taken from his home against his will eventually chose to return to that same land. A slave became a missionary. A victim became a messenger of hope. And a man who had every reason to walk away chose instead to dedicate his life to serving the very people connected to his deepest wounds. That choice changed not only his own life, but also the course of Irish Christian history. Even today, behind every legend, every celebration, and every symbol associated with St. Patrick, there remains the remarkable story of a real man. A man who suffered, a man who struggled, a man who believed, and a man who chose obedience over fear. His journey reminds us that God does not always erase our past. Sometimes he transforms it into the very foundation of our purpose. Patrick could never erase the years he spent in slavery. He could never recover the time that had been taken from him, but he could decide what kind of man he would become because of those experiences. And that decision became the defining legacy of his life. His story, however, was far from over. The greatest confrontations still lay ahead. The most difficult trials were yet to come. The missionary before the powerful. When Patrick returned to Ireland, he knew his mission would not be easy. The land he had once known as a slave now stood before him in a completely different way. He was not returning to seek revenge. He was returning because he believed he had received a calling, and to fulfill that calling, he would need to enter a world governed by kings, tribal chiefs, and ancient religious traditions. The Ireland of that time was not a united kingdom. It was made up of different territories, each influenced by its own leaders. A king's authority did not necessarily mean dominion over the whole island. Each region had its own structures, customs, and alliances, and Patrick would need to cross this landscape proclaiming a message that could profoundly transform society. He had no army, he possessed no riches, he had no support from any great political power. His instrument was the Word. His strength lay in faith, and his mission began with something simple. Speaking, Patrick proclaimed Jesus Christ. He taught the principles of the Christian faith. He baptized those who accepted his message, and he sought to form communities capable of continuing the work after he had passed through. It was a slow task. No society changes overnight. Patrick could not simply arrive in a region and erase centuries of tradition. He needed to talk, to teach, to wait, and often to face opposition. The Christian message was already known in some parts of Ireland before his work there. Christians already existed on the island, and other missionaries had worked among these communities. For this reason, the history must be understood carefully. Patrick was not solely responsible for the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. His importance lies in the role he played in expanding and strengthening the Christian faith during a decisive period. And his mission was only just beginning. As he moved forward, Patrick encountered different communities. Some people listened to his words, others were suspicious. Some leaders showed interest, others saw his presence as a threat. Religion was part of the structure of society. The old religious leaders held influence. Traditions were passed down from generation to generation. For this reason, a new message could provoke changes that went far beyond spiritual life. Patrick knew he needed to walk with caution, but he also knew he could not abandon his mission out of fear. In his own writings, he shows awareness of the dangers he faced. He does not write like a man who believes himself invincible. Quite the opposite. He acknowledges his limitations. He speaks of his difficulties, and he attributes to God the strength he found to continue. This trait appears several times in his testimony. For Patrick, his mission was not a personal conquest. He believed he had been sent, and that certainty mattered more to him than his own reputation. In a society where kings sought power and prestige, Patrick presented a different message. He spoke of a kingdom that did not depend on wealth. He spoke of a God who was not limited by borders. He spoke of a faith that could reach both the powerful and the humble. And this message began to find space. We do not know exactly how many people were converted by Patrick, nor is it possible to reconstruct every place he visited. The available sources are limited, but we know that his activity contributed to the growth of Christian communities and to the consolidation of the faith in different regions. And as his influence grew, his mission began to cross paths with the most powerful men of his time. It was then that tradition began telling stories about his confrontations with kings and religious leaders. One of the best known is related to the celebration of Easter. According to later accounts, Patrick lit a great bonfire on a night when there were established rules about which fires could be lit. The flame was said to be seen from afar, and the act reportedly caught the attention of the king and his men. Tradition presents this moment as a symbolic confrontation. On one side, established power. On the other, a missionary proclaiming a new faith. The fire came to represent the light of Christ, a light that, according to the Christian message, could not be overcome by darkness. But we must separate tradition from what can be proven. The details of this story appear in later sources and cannot be fully confirmed by Patrick's own writings. Even so, the narrative remained alive because it expressed a truth about the period. The arrival of Christianity represented change, and change almost always provokes resistance. Patrick was not simply teaching a new doctrine, he was taking part in a cultural transformation that would take generations. And this transformation did not happen only through great confrontations. Most of his work was probably much simpler: talking, teaching, traveling, baptizing, organizing communities, forming new leaders, and continuing to walk. It was quiet work, but great transformations often begin this way. One person listens, then another. A small community is born, then another, and slowly what seemed small begins to grow. Patrick needed to trust in that process. He might never see the full result of his mission, but he kept planting, and in time others would continue his work. That is how the Christian presence began to grow stronger, and many years later, Ireland would become known for its monasteries and centers of Christian learning. Manuscripts would be produced, ancient texts would be preserved, and Irish missionaries would travel to other regions of Europe. Patrick could not have imagined that future, but his mission would be part of the history that led to it. Meanwhile, as his influence grew, extraordinary accounts also began to appear. People started telling stories about his life. Some were based on real events, others were shaped by tradition, and others likely arose to represent, through symbols, what his followers believed his mission meant. Among these stories was the famous tale of the shamrock. According to tradition, Patrick used a three-leaved plant to explain the doctrine of the Trinity. The image was simple and easy to understand. One plant, three leaves, one single whole: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Over time, the shamrock became inseparable from the memory of St. Patrick, but there is no contemporary evidence that he actually used this plant in his teachings. The story emerged later. The same happened with the tale of the snakes. According to legend, Patrick drove all the snakes out of Ireland. The image became powerful, but there is no historical evidence that this happened. For this reason, many interpret the account symbolically. The snakes would represent evil or the ancient religious forces that tradition associated with the saint's mission. These stories should not be confused with historical facts, but they reveal how later generations came to see Patrick. To them, he had arrived as a man who confronted darkness, and his mission came to be represented by symbols of light, protection, and victory. But the real Patrick was far more human. His writings reveal someone aware of his own limitations. He does not describe himself as a flawless hero. He does not present his mission as the result of his own intelligence. His confidence rested in God. This humility may be one of the most important traits of his character. The man who had known slavery did not believe his strength came only from himself. He knew what it was to depend on others to survive. He knew what it was to have no control over his own fate. And because of this, his faith became the center of his life. Now, however, he faced a different challenge. He no longer needed to fight for his own freedom. He needed to protect the mission he believed he had received, and that meant facing danger. In his writings, Patrick describes situations in which his life was threatened. At one point, he speaks of being captured and facing the risk of death. These accounts show that his mission was not a peaceful journey. He could be attacked, he could be imprisoned, he could be killed. Even so, he continued. This reality helps us understand his courage. Patrick was not brave because he felt no fear. He was brave because he kept going despite it. This distinction matters. Faith does not necessarily eliminate danger, but it can give strength to face what seems impossible. And Patrick believed he was not alone. To him, God had been present during his years of slavery, had been present during his escape, had guided his return, and was now present in his mission. This conviction sustained his steps. But another question remained to be faced. How could a foreign message take root in such a different society? The answer was not found only among great leaders. It was found among ordinary people, families, communities, men and women who listened, people who accepted baptism, people who began to live according to the new faith. The transformation happened person by person, and over time, these small communities formed an ever larger network. Patrick did not need to convert an entire island in a single day. He only needed to keep going. Each strengthened community represented a new seed, and each person reached could carry the message forward. Perhaps that is why his work survived, because a mission does not depend only on the one who begins it. It depends on those who carry it on, and Patrick knew this. For this reason, his work was not limited to preaching. He needed to prepare for the future. The faith he taught needed to continue after his departure, and that process would take time, a great deal of time. Looking back at his story, we see that Patrick's greatest impact did not happen in a single moment. It was the result of years of perseverance, a journey, a community, a conversion, a teaching, a new generation, and then another. Thus, slowly, the Christian presence grew stronger. But something even deeper was happening. Patrick was building a new relationship between his own history and the land that had once enslaved him. Ireland had been the place of his greatest pain. Now it was becoming the place of his greatest mission. This did not erase his past, but it transformed the meaning of his life. The young man who had arrived as a prisoner was now remembered as someone who had chosen to serve, and that choice became the center of his memory. But as the years passed, Patrick began to grow old. The travels took their toll. The body that had endured years of slavery and long journeys no longer had the same strength. The mission had advanced, but his life was coming to an end. And it was at this point that a new question arose. What would happen when Patrick was no longer there? Who would carry on his work? What would happen to the communities he had helped form? And, above all, how would his story be remembered? He could not control the future. He could not know which stories would be told. He could not prevent legends from arising, but there was something he could leave behind: his testimony, his faith, and the communities he had helped strengthen. When Patrick finally passed from history, his mission would not vanish with him. Others would continue. Others would teach. Others would write. And slowly, the name of that former slave would begin to cross beyond the limits of his own generation. Patrick's memory would grow, first in Ireland, then in other regions, and many centuries later, it would reach the whole world. But as more time passed, it became harder to separate the real man from the stories built around him. The 5th century missionary would be transformed into a figure of legend. His name would be linked to the shamrock, to the snakes, to miracles, to confrontations, to symbols. But behind all of this, a man still existed, a man who had been torn from his family, a man who had known slavery, a man who managed to escape, a man who returned home, and a man who chose to go back to the land where he had suffered. That is the most powerful part of his story. Not the myth, not the legend, but the choice. Patrick chose to return, chose to serve, chose to continue, and that decision would forever change the way his name would be remembered. At the end of his life, he may not have known he would be called a saint by future generations. He may not have imagined that one day millions would celebrate his memory, but he knew one thing. His life had a purpose, and as long as he had strength, he would keep fulfilling that purpose. That is how the former slave became a missionary, and that is how the missionary began to become a legend. But the final chapter of his life was still to come, the moment when his journey would reach its end. What do we really know about his death? Where was Patrick buried? Why are there so many different versions of where he rests? And how did his memory grow after his voice finally fell silent? To answer these questions, we need to cross into the last days of his life, and after his death, follow an even greater transformation, because the man who walked through Ireland during his life would continue traveling through the memory of the peoples. His story would be told, retold, and transformed until, many centuries later, the former slave who once dreamed of going home would become one of the most well-known saints in the world. The story of St. Patrick, however, had not yet ended. The final years of St. Patrick. As the years passed, Patrick's mission began to bear fruit. Christian communities were established in different regions. New leaders emerged, and the message he proclaimed continued to be passed on by those who had accepted his faith. But Ireland's transformation did not happen all at once. Patrick's work was part of a long process, built up over generations. He was not alone. Other missionaries were also active on the island, and some Christian communities already existed before his arrival. Even so, Patrick had become one of the most important figures in this movement. His personal experience gave special weight to his testimony. He knew that land, he knew its language and its customs. He had lived among its people during his years of slavery, and now he returned as a man who had chosen to dedicate his life to the faith. This path made him an unusual figure. He was not a foreigner arriving completely unfamiliar with local reality. He had known Ireland from the inside. He knew what it was to live far from home. He knew what it was to depend on others. He knew what it was to face loneliness. Now he used that experience to fulfill his mission. But the years had left their mark. The long journeys were difficult, the dangers continued, and Patrick knew his life was drawing to a close. We do not know every event of his final years. The available documents do not allow us to reconstruct each stage of his old age, nor do we know exactly where he spent his last days. Most of the preserved information comes from his own writings and from traditions that arose later. For this reason, when we speak of Patrick's final moments, we must distinguish history from tradition. The date traditionally associated with his death is March 17. It was on this day that, over the centuries, his memory came to be celebrated. The site of his burial is also a matter of tradition. Downpatrick, in present-day Northern Ireland, is considered the place associated with his tomb. But there is no absolute certainty about all the details. After so many centuries, documents were lost, accounts were altered, and different communities came to claim a special connection to his memory. This is common in the history of ancient religious figures. When someone becomes important to a community, their memory comes to be preserved in different ways. It was no different with Patrick. But his death did not mark the end of his influence. In fact, it was after his death that his name began to grow even further. The mission continued through other people. Christian communities grew stronger. New leaders took on responsibilities. And over the following centuries, Ireland developed an increasingly strong Christian tradition. Monasteries came to play an important role. They became places of prayer, study, and the preservation of knowledge. Monks copied manuscripts and passed texts on to later generations. Irish Christian culture began to gain prominence. Centuries later, missionaries from Ireland would travel to other regions of Europe. They would found religious communities and take part in major evangelizing movements. This development cannot be attributed to Patrick alone. It would be wrong to say he single-handedly brought about this transformation, but his mission was part of the roots of that process, and his name remained tied to the history of Christianity's expansion on the island. As society changed, Patrick's memory also began to be transformed. At first, he was remembered mainly as a missionary. Over time, he came to be venerated as a saint, and later, he became a symbol of Irish identity itself. This transformation did not happen overnight. It took many centuries. With each generation, new stories were told. Some preserved real events, others added symbolic elements, and some were shaped entirely by tradition. This is how many of the stories we know today came about. One of the most famous is Patrick's association with snakes. Tradition holds that he drove all the snakes out of Ireland. The story became known throughout the world, but historically it cannot be confirmed. There is no evidence that Patrick accomplished this feat. Moreover, Ireland never had native snake populations like other regions of Europe. For this reason, many scholars interpret the story as an allegory. The snakes may represent evil, or they may symbolize the ancient beliefs that the spread of Christianity began to replace. In this sense, the narrative represents a spiritual victory, but it should not be presented as a proven historical event. The same is true of the famous shamrock. According to a well-known tradition, Patrick used a three-leafed plant to explain the doctrine of the Trinity. The comparison was simple: 3 leaves, one single plant, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The image became one of the greatest symbols associated with the saint. But there is likewise no contemporary evidence that he actually used the shamrock this way. The story emerged much later. Even so, it became an inseparable part of his memory. These examples show how a historical figure can be transformed over the centuries. The real man remains, but around him, new stories begin to grow. The historical Patrick was a missionary. The Patrick of legend became a man surrounded by miracles, and the Patrick of popular culture eventually became an international symbol. It is important to understand these 3 dimensions, because none of them, on its own, fully explains his significance. History shows us the man, tradition shows how his followers saw him, and culture reveals how his memory stayed alive. But there is something that remained constant across all these versions: the transformation of his life. This is the one element no legend needed to invent. Patrick really was enslaved, really did manage to escape, really did return home, and, according to his own testimony, really did decide to go back to Ireland to carry out a religious mission. This trajectory alone is enough to explain why his story became so powerful. The man who had been taken against his will returned voluntarily. That decision may be the most extraordinary aspect of his life. He could have chosen to forget that land. He could have rebuilt his life far from everything he had suffered, but he chose to return, not to seek revenge, not to seize power, but to proclaim his faith. This act completely changed the meaning of his story. Ireland, which had once represented suffering, became the place of his mission, and that mission became the legacy by which he would be remembered. But his legacy was not limited to religion. Over the centuries, Patrick came to represent Irish identity itself. His name became linked to the island. His image began to appear in churches and paintings. The day dedicated to his memory became an important date, and, much later, the celebration would cross beyond the borders of Ireland. The Irish diaspora played a key role in this expansion. Millions of Irish people left their homeland over the centuries and carried their traditions with them. Among these was devotion to St. Patrick. In different countries, communities began to celebrate March 17. Over time, these celebrations took on cultural characteristics. Parades were organized. Irish symbols began appearing in the streets. The shamrock became a constant presence. The color green gained prominence. And what had begun as a religious celebration also became a cultural expression. Patrick's name had reached a scale he probably could never have imagined. A missionary who lived in the 5th century became known across different continents. But behind the festivities and symbols, his original story continued to be preserved. And perhaps it is precisely that story that deserves the most attention. Because Patrick did not begin his life as a saint. He was not born knowing what his destiny would be. His path was shaped by events he did not choose. Slavery was forced upon him. Separation from his family was a tragedy. His escape was a necessity. But after regaining his freedom, he had to make a choice, and he chose to return. That choice is the central point of his story. It shows that a person can be marked by suffering without being defined by it. Patrick carried the memories of his past, but he did not let them completely determine his future. His life took on a new meaning, and that meaning was tied to faith. In his writings, he shows a deep conviction that God had guided his path. To him, the events of his life were not simply a string of accidents. He believed he had been prepared for a mission. This interpretation gave meaning to his suffering, not because the pain was good, not because slavery was justifiable, but because, in his view, God could turn a terrible experience into an opportunity for service. This way of viewing his own life became a fundamental part of his legacy, and perhaps that is why his story continues to inspire people, because it speaks of new beginnings, of purpose, of choices, of the possibility of finding a new path after a great loss. Patrick could not get back the years he had lost, but he found a way to move forward, and his journey ended up influencing generations. After his death, others carried on his work. The Christian faith spread, new communities were established, Ireland became a major center of spirituality, and his name remained tied to that process. But as his memory grew, a new problem arose. The more time passed, the harder it became to separate fact from legend. Extraordinary stories were told. Miracles were attributed to him. Supernatural confrontations appeared in later accounts, and the historical man began to disappear behind the character created by tradition. This is why his own writings are so important. They are among the oldest sources we have about his life. In them, we do not find a man concerned with building a heroic image. We find someone who acknowledges his own limitations. Patrick speaks of his own weakness. He admits he lacked a strong education. He shows humility, and he credits God for the success of his mission. This trait sets the historical Patrick apart from the legendary figure. The saint of legend seems invincible. The missionary of the documents knows fear. The hero of the stories seems to have all the answers. The real man shows doubt and acknowledges his own limitations. And perhaps it is exactly this humanity that makes his story so powerful. He did not need to be perfect to fulfill his mission. He needed to keep going, and he did, until the end of his life. After his death, his memory crossed through generations. Ireland kept changing, so did Europe. Kingdoms rose and fell. New wars broke out, new borders were drawn. But Patrick's name remained. His story was preserved in manuscripts. His memory was passed down in communities. His feast day was celebrated, and, slowly, he stopped being just a figure in Irish history. He became a figure known throughout the world. But there is still an important part of this transformation. The way Patrick came to be officially recognized as a saint. Unlike modern canonization processes, which follow defined procedures, the veneration of saints in antiquity followed different paths. The memory of a man considered holy could grow among communities. His tomb could become a place of pilgrimage. His writings could be preserved, and his story could be passed down as an example of faith. This is how his veneration became established over the centuries, not through a single event, but through collective memory. Each generation added a new layer until his name became inseparable from the history of Ireland itself. And then one of the greatest ironies of his story emerged. Patrick had spent part of his youth as a slave in that land, but he ended up being remembered as its great patron. The one who had once been a foreigner became a national symbol. The man who arrived against his will became someone celebrated by millions. The young man who dreamed of escaping became the one whose memory would remain forever tied to Ireland. His story had come full circle, but the legacy was only just beginning, because centuries later, the modern world would turn his memory into one of the most widely known cultural celebrations on the planet. March 17 would stop being just a religious date. It would become a celebration of Irish culture, and in many places, people who did not even know the details of his life would come to wear green and carry shamrocks. But perhaps the best way to honor his memory is to return to the beginning, to return to the young man who once lost everything, to return to the man who found strength during the hard years, to return to the missionary who decided to go back, and to remember that before he was a symbol, Patrick was a person. His story did not begin with a celebration. It began with a tragedy. It did not begin with a crown. It began with chains. It did not begin with fame. It began with loneliness. And perhaps that is exactly why his legacy has lasted so many centuries, because his life shows that a person's fate can change completely. One chapter can end in pain, but another can begin. Patrick's story would still have one last great chapter. The moment his memory would definitively leave the borders of Ireland, the moment the saint would become a symbol, the moment the missionary would be remembered not only for his faith, but for his cultural significance. And upon reaching that point, we will once again need to separate the historical man from the figure created by tradition, because the true story of St. Patrick runs far deeper than the legends we know. And perhaps, after learning his full story, it becomes possible to understand why his name still lives on after roughly 15 centuries. A man was taken as a slave. A man found freedom. A man returned. A man served. And after his life ended, his story kept on walking. This is how the legacy of St. Patrick was born, the birth of a legend. Patrick's death did not end his story. In fact, it was after his passing that his name began to take on a scale he could never have imagined. During his life, Patrick had been a missionary. After his death, he became a spiritual reference point. And, as the centuries passed, his memory grew until it went far beyond the borders of Ireland. But this process did not happen right away. The first generations that came after Patrick continued living in a world very different from the one we know today. There were no modern means of communication. There were no mass-produced books. Stories circulated mainly through oral tradition and hand-copied manuscripts. A story told in one community could reach another region and, after many years, pick up new details. In this way, Patrick's memory was built slowly. The historical man remained the starting point, but around him, narratives began to appear that tried to explain his importance. Some stories highlighted his faith, others spoke of his confrontations, some presented miracles, and others turned his mission into a symbolic battle between light and darkness. This is how Patrick began to become a figure larger than his own life. Ireland was changing too. Christianity was growing stronger. Religious communities were expanding. Monasteries were spreading, and these places came to play an important role in preserving culture and knowledge. Monks copied manuscripts, studied religious texts, preserved ancient writings, and passed knowledge on to new generations. Over time, Ireland became known for its monastic tradition. This transformation was not the work of one person alone, but Patrick came to be remembered as one of the figures tied to the early stages of that process. His name represented the beginning of a new era, and the more Christianity grew, the stronger his memory became. It was in this context that accounts of the saint's extraordinary deeds began to appear. One of the most famous stories held that Patrick had used the shamrock to explain the Trinity. The image was simple and powerful: 3 leaves, 1 plant, 3 persons, 1 God. The story helped explain one of the most complex concepts in the Christian faith. But despite its popularity, there is no contemporary historical evidence that Patrick used the shamrock this way. The association arose later. Even so, the symbol became inseparable from his image. Centuries later, the shamrock would appear in practically every celebration linked to the saint. But perhaps no story is as well known as that of the snakes. According to tradition, Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland. This narrative became one of the most popular elements of his legend. Historically, however, there is no evidence that Patrick did this. The most likely explanation is symbolic. In Christian tradition, the serpent is often associated with evil, so the expulsion of the snakes could represent faith's victory over what was seen as opposed to Christianity. The story may not be a literal record, but it reveals how later generations interpreted Patrick's mission. To them, he had been someone who confronted powerful forces, someone who had brought a new message, someone who had helped transform a society. And, over time, the missionary became a symbol of that transformation. But there is an important difference between the historical Patrick and the Patrick of legend. The historical man did not need supernatural stories to be extraordinary. His own life was already unusual. A young man was taken against his will, spent years away from his family, lived as a slave, managed to escape, and then decided to return. This last detail remains the most striking. Patrick did not return because someone forced him to. He returned because he believed he had a mission. That choice completely transformed his story. The land that had been the setting of his greatest pain became the place where he chose to dedicate his life. And this explains part of the strength of his legacy. He did not erase the past, he transformed the role the past would play in his future. But the growth of his memory did not happen only within Ireland. Over the centuries, Irish culture spread to other regions. People left their homeland in search of new opportunities. Families crossed oceans, communities formed in other countries, and these people carried their traditions with them. Among them was devotion to St. Patrick. The celebration of March 17 began to take on new meanings. What had once been mainly a religious date also came to represent Irish culture and identity. In different cities, communities organized celebrations. Traditional music gained space. The shamrock became a symbol. The color green appeared more and more, and slowly Patrick's name crossed beyond the borders of his homeland. A missionary who had lived in the 5th century became known in places he could never have imagined. This expansion brought a curious shift. Many people came to know the symbol without knowing the story. They knew March 17 was St. Patrick's Day. They knew green was linked to the date. They knew the shamrock, but they did not know the young man who had been enslaved. They did not know his years of loneliness. They did not know his escape. And they may not have known that after regaining his freedom, he chose to return. Behind the celebration was a human story, and that story ran far deeper than any celebration. Patrick was not important only because he became a national symbol. His life represents a transformation. He began as someone with no control over his own fate. He ended as someone who believed he had found a purpose. This change did not happen in a single moment. It was built slowly, during the hard years, during his escape, during his return, during his mission. Each stage prepared the way for the next, and perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons of his journey. We do not always understand the meaning of a phase while we are living it. Patrick probably did not understand what his years of slavery would come to mean in the future. He was simply trying to survive. But when he looked back, he interpreted his life differently. He believed God had been present even in the moments he could not perceive it. This view appears in his writings. Patrick does not write like someone who believes he controlled every event. He writes like someone who was guided. For him, faith had transformed the way he saw his past. This did not mean the pain stopped existing, but it meant the pain would not have the power to define the rest of his life. This idea helped make his story so enduring, because Patrick's experience goes beyond the context of Ireland. It speaks about people who face situations they did not choose, people who lose their freedom, people who need to start over, people who carry wounds for years, and people who, despite everything, find a reason to keep going. This is why his story continues to be told, not only because of the miracles attributed to him, not only because of the shamrock, not only because of tradition, but because there is a human transformation at the center of it all. The young man who lost his freedom found a new direction, and the direction he found ended up influencing generations. But another transformation was still taking place. The Ireland Patrick knew would not be the same Ireland of the following centuries. The spread of Christianity profoundly changed the island's religious and cultural life. Monasteries became centers of learning, manuscript production grew, Christian spirituality took on new forms, and the Irish monastic tradition came to have influence beyond the island itself. Centuries later, Irish missionaries would travel to regions of continental Europe. Among them was Columbanus, who left Ireland and founded important monastic communities. These missionaries belonged to later generations. They were not direct disciples of Patrick, but their existence shows the result of a tradition that had matured over the centuries. Ireland went from being a region where Christianity was still a minority faith to becoming a major center of spirituality. And Patrick remained one of the names associated with the origins of that transformation. But the story must also acknowledge its limits. We cannot claim that Patrick alone converted all of Ireland. We cannot say he was the first Christian to reach the island. We cannot confirm every miracle attributed to him, and we cannot treat every legend as historical fact. The real story is more complex, and precisely because of that, more interesting. Patrick was part of a process that involved different people, different communities, different generations. His importance lies in having become one of the leading figures in that process. But the transformation continued long after his death, and that continuity was essential to his memory's survival. Each generation received his story, and each generation passed it on again. Some added details, others created symbols, others simply preserved his name, until slowly, Patrick stopped being just a figure of the past. He became part of a people's identity. This transformation can be seen in the celebration of his feast day itself. March 17 began as tied to religious memory. Over time, it took on a cultural dimension, and when Irish communities settled in other countries, the celebration went with them. Before long, cities far from Ireland began celebrating the date. Streets were decorated, parades were organized, monuments were lit up, and green became an international mark. The image of St. Patrick had gone global. But even with all this popularity, the real story remained much simpler. A man, a mission, a life marked by suffering and faith. Perhaps this is why it is so important to return to the ancient sources. When we read Patrick's writings, we find a voice different from the one presented by legend. He does not seem interested in building a heroic image. Quite the opposite. He shows humility, he acknowledges his limitations, he speaks of his own ignorance, and he credits God for what he believes he accomplished. This allows us to better understand who he really was. Not a flawless character, not a man without fear, not someone who never faced hardship, but someone who kept going despite it. This distinction is essential. Patrick's courage did not lie in the absence of danger. It lay in the decision to move forward. His mission could fail. He could be rejected. He could face violence. He could be forgotten. But he kept working, and when he died, he had no way of knowing the size of the legacy he would leave behind. He did not know his name would be celebrated 15 centuries later. He did not know it would become tied to a nation's identity. He did not know people on different continents would take part in celebrations in his honor. He simply did what he believed was his duty, and perhaps this is the essence of his legacy. Great stories do not always begin with grand plans. Sometimes they begin with one person trying to do what they believe is right. Patrick did not control the future, but he controlled his choices, and he chose to keep going. The result was a story that outlasted his own existence. But there is still a key part of this journey left to cover: St. Patrick's transformation into a figure venerated by the church and by the people. How did his religious memory become established? How did his name come to be associated with sainthood? And how were the traditions about his life recorded and preserved? These answers take us into the centuries after his death. During this period, different authors began writing about his life. One of the best-known texts is the Life of St. Patrick, attributed to Murcu, written centuries after the events themselves. Another important account was produced by Tyricon. These texts are valuable because they show how Patrick's memory had evolved, but they also need to be read with caution. They were written long after his death. For this reason, they mix historical elements with religious traditions and accounts that cannot be confirmed. Even so, they helped preserve his memory. Thanks to these accounts, new generations continued to learn his name, and as time passed, his figure became increasingly important. The missionary came to be presented as a saint. The saint came to be seen as a symbol, and the symbol came to represent an identity. This transformation took centuries, but it was exactly this process that allowed Patrick to reach the modern world. Today, when someone thinks of St. Patrick, many images may come to mind: a shamrock, the color green, a celebration, a church, a parade. But behind these symbols lies a much older story, a story that began with a young man who lost his freedom and ended with a man who found a purpose. Perhaps Patrick's greatest legacy lies exactly in that transformation. He could not choose what happened to him, but he chose what he would do afterward. He could not erase his past, but he decided not to live imprisoned by it. He could not change the years he lost, but he devoted the years he was given to a mission, and that choice has lasted across the centuries. This is why his story remains relevant, because all of us, at some point, face events we did not choose. We all know loss. We all face moments of uncertainty, 15 centuries. And Patrick's journey shows that a story does not have to end at its most painful moment. There can be a new chapter. There can be a fresh start. Purpose can emerge where there was once only suffering. That is what happened with Patrick. His life began with a loss, but it did not end there. It began with slavery, but it did not end in slavery. It began with separation, but he found a new community. It began with fear, but he found courage. And it began with a young man who wanted nothing more than to go home, until many years later, that same man decided to return to the place that had once been his prison. That is the true power of his story. Not the legend, not the symbol, not the myth, but the choice. Patrick chose to return, chose to serve, chose to remain faithful to what he believed. And after his life ended, others kept telling his story, century after century, generation after generation, until his name crossed the ocean, crossed borders, crossed cultures, and reached the whole world. But it still remains to understand how this ancient religious memory turned into the worldwide celebration we know today. How did St. Patrick's Day stop being a date confined to Irish Christian tradition and become an international cultural phenomenon? How did Green and the Shamrock gain such strength? And, above all, what remained of the real Patrick's story amid so many symbols? It is in this final chapter that we will see how the ancient missionary became one of the most recognized figures in Irish culture. And perhaps, after learning this whole journey, it becomes possible to look at March 17 in a completely different way. Because behind the celebration, there is a man. Behind the symbol, there is a story. And behind the legend, there is a life that began in an unexpected way. The life of a young man who lost his freedom, found his faith, and turned his suffering into a mission that would cross the eternal legacy of St. Patrick. The final years of Patrick's life were marked by the ongoing continuation of his mission. After so many roads traveled, so many communities visited, and so many challenges faced, the man who had once been taken as a slave had already left his mark on the history of Ireland. His mission had not transformed everything at once. Change happened slowly. Christian communities grew stronger. New generations received the teachings of the faith. Other missionaries carried the work forward, and little by little, Christianity came to occupy an ever larger place in the life of the island. Patrick did not live to see all the consequences of his work. As with those who plant a tree, he could not know the full extent of the shade it would one day provide. But he had planted seeds, and others would tend to them. Over the centuries, Ireland would become known for its Christian tradition. Monasteries would be established. Centers of learning would emerge. Manuscripts would be copied and preserved. Men and women would devote their lives to prayer and knowledge, and Irish missionaries would travel to distant lands. Patrick's name would remain tied to that history, not as the sole cause of that transformation, but as one of the most important figures associated with its beginning. Then came the moment when his own life drew near its end. We do not know every detail of his final days. The historical record does not allow us to fully reconstruct this period. There are also different traditions about where he was buried. The town of Downpatrick in Northern Ireland is traditionally associated with his tomb. March 17 became the day dedicated to his memory, but after his death, something extraordinary happened. His mission ended, his voice fell silent, but his story began to grow. Later generations passed on what they knew of his life, and, as time went by, new stories were added. Some preserved historical events, others carried religious teachings, and some turned into legend. This is how Patrick came to be associated with the shamrock. According to tradition, he used a three-leafed plant to explain the mystery of the Trinity. The story is known throughout the world, but there is no contemporary evidence that Patrick actually used the shamrock this way. The same is true of the famous story of the snakes. Tradition holds that Patrick drove all the snakes out of Ireland. Historically, there is no evidence this happened. For this reason, many read the account as a symbol. The serpent could represent evil or the old forces that Christianity sought to overcome. In this way, the story came to represent a spiritual victory. But when we set the legends aside, we find a story that is already extraordinary on its own. Patrick was enslaved. He managed to escape. He returned to his family, and then he decided to go back to Ireland. That decision remains at the center of his story. He could have chosen to forget that place. He could have built a new life far from everything he had suffered. But he decided to return. And he returned not to seek revenge. He returned to serve. That choice completely transformed his memory. Ireland, which had been the setting of his greatest pain, became the place where he would devote his life to his mission. And that mission continued long after his death. Centuries passed. The Irish Christian tradition grew. Patrick's memory grew stronger, and his name began to cross beyond the borders of Ireland itself. As Irish communities migrated to other parts of the world, his feast day spread with them. March 17 came to be celebrated in different countries. Parades were organized. Green became the symbol of the date. The shamrock came to represent the celebration, and St. Patrick became known even to people who had never heard the details of his real story. The celebration took on a cultural dimension, but behind the festivities and the symbols, the life of a man remained. A man who had known slavery, a man who had faced loneliness, a man who found freedom, and a man who decided to return. This is the part of his story that should never be forgotten, because Patrick was not born a great leader. He did not begin his life as a famous saint. He had no wealth or power. His path was built through choices, and the most important of them was deciding what he would do with his own story. He could not change the past. He could not get back the years he had lost. He could not erase the memories of slavery, but he could choose the future, and he chose to serve. His faith became the center of that decision. In the writings he left behind, Patrick shows deep humility. He acknowledges his limitations. He does not present his mission as a personal achievement. He credits God with the strength to carry on. To him, his life had been guided by a greater providence. That conviction sustained his journey, and perhaps it is exactly this humanity that makes his story so powerful. Patrick was not someone who lived without fear. He was someone who kept going despite fear. He was not someone who never suffered. He was someone who decided not to let suffering define his fate. This distinction is essential. Courage does not lie in never knowing pain. It lies in continuing to walk after it. And Patrick walked. He walked as a slave. He walked when he managed to escape. He walked when he returned home. And he walked again when he went back to Ireland, until his steps finally came to an end. But his legacy carried on. This may be the clearest proof that a life can be greater than its own lifetime. Patrick died, but his mission continued through others. His name continued to be remembered. His story continued to be told, and his memory crossed through generations. The young man once taken against his will was now remembered as one of the greatest symbols of Ireland. The slave became a missionary. The missionary became a saint, and the saint became the symbol of a culture known throughout the world. This transformation took centuries, but it began with a choice, the choice to return. Perhaps then, the true story of St. Patrick is not about the shamrock, not about the snakes, not about the legends. It is about a decision. the decision not to let the past have the final word. That message still holds true today, because even now, many people carry difficult stories. There are people who face loss, people who endure injustice, people who need to start over, people who believe certain chapters of their lives can never be overcome. Patrick's story does not promise that the pain will disappear, but it shows that a life can go on after it. The past can leave marks, but it does not have to determine every chapter that follows. Patrick carried his memories, but he also carried his hope, and it was that hope that kept him going. Perhaps that is why his story has survived for so many centuries, because although it belongs to a distant time, it speaks to something that remains deeply human: the need to find a purpose, the capacity to start over, the strength to keep going, and the hope that a life marked by suffering can still produce something good. This is St. Patrick's deepest legacy, not just the story of a saint, but the story of a transformation. A young man lost his freedom, but found his faith. A man suffered, but chose to serve. A missionary faced hardship, but kept going. And when his life ended, his story remained. Today, March 17, is celebrated in many places around the world. Millions know his name. Millions recognize the shamrock. Millions wear green. But before all these symbols, there was a person, a real man, with fears, with limitations, with doubts, with faith, and with a story that began in pain. Perhaps this is why his memory has lasted 15 centuries, because legends can change, symbols can change, celebrations can change, but the story of someone who found a new purpose after losing almost everything remains something any generation can understand. Patrick reminds us that we cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can still choose what we do afterward. He did not choose to be enslaved, but he chose how to live after gaining his freedom. He did not choose to lose years of his youth, but he chose how to use the years he still had. He did not choose the beginning of his story, but he actively took part in shaping its ending. And his ending was not determined by chains. It was determined by his mission. When we look at his life as a whole, we see a path that seems to trace a full circle. The young man taken far from his family managed to escape. The man who regained his freedom decided to return. The land that had been his prison became the place where he found his purpose, and the one who was once unknown became one of the most remembered religious figures in the world. That is the true greatness of his story. It lies not only in what happened to him, it lies in how he responded to what happened. Patrick could have let hatred take over his life. He could have chosen to live only to forget, but he chose a different path, and that choice changed not only his own story, it also shaped the history of a nation. His work was carried on by others, his faith reached new generations, and the tradition that grew in Ireland crossed borders. Over the centuries, his memory grew larger and larger, until it reached the modern world, until it reached the cities where his name is celebrated, until it reached people who, even without knowing every detail of his life, recognize his image. But when all of this is set aside, a simple story remains. A young man was taken. A man escaped. A missionary returned. A people welcomed him. A mission began, and a memory endured. This is the story of St. Patrick, a story that began with the loss of freedom, passed through years of uncertainty, and ended by leaving a legacy that outlasted the passage of time. Patrick did not live to see the world celebrate his name. He did not see the parades. He did not see cities lit up in green. He did not see people wearing the shamrock as a symbol. He never knew the scale his memory would reach. But perhaps that did not matter, because his mission never depended on knowing the outcome. He simply needed to fulfill what he believed he had been called to do, and he did, to the end. When his journey ended, others carried on. When his voice fell silent, others spoke. When his life came to a close, his story began to be passed down, and generation after generation, it reached us. So when we remember St. Patrick, we should look beyond the legends. We should remember the man, the young man who suffered, the survivor who found freedom, the missionary who chose to return, and the man of faith who devoted his life to service. Perhaps this is the true message left by his journey. No difficult chapter has to be the final chapter. A story can change direction. A wound can turn into strength. A loss can be followed by a new beginning. And a life that seemed destined for suffering can find an unexpected purpose. That is what happened to Patrick. His story began amid pain, but it did not end there. It began with chains, but it ended with freedom. It began with separation, but it found a new mission. It began with an unknown young man, and it ended with a name remembered for centuries. St. Patrick died, but his legacy remained, and perhaps that is exactly why, so many centuries later, we still tell his story. Not because every legend can be proven, not because every account is historically precise, but because there is a truth at the center of it all. The truth that a person can pass through terrible moments and still find the strength to go on. The truth that the past does not have to control the future. And the truth that a choice made with faith and courage can reach generations not yet born. This is the true story of St. Patrick, and here his journey ends. The young man, once torn from his home, found freedom again. The man who could have forgotten Ireland chose to return. The missionary fulfilled his mission, and the saint left the world a legacy that crossed 15 centuries. His name remains, his story remains, and his memory continues to be remembered. Because some lives come to an end, but some stories keep on walking, and the story of St. Patrick continues.